Good morning, folks. It's your Self Shift crew back for another Saturday morning podcast. You got Patrick, Derek,
Hey, good morning, everyone.
and of course Doug, who's back from some travels this week.
Hello, everyone.
And we've got an interesting topic today. Like all of our topics are usually pretty interesting. And this one is recognizing that we all live in separate realities. Now, we're not going to talk about this from a physics standpoint, although that would be a good subject for another podcast, but from a human experience perspective and a human perception perspective. As usual, we're going to start out with a few quotes to kind of set the stage and set the frame. The first one is from Stephen Covey. We see the world not as it is, but as we are, or as we are conditioned to see it. Another one from William Shakespeare. This is our first quote from William Shakespeare on the podcast. There is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. All right, so now that we framed it up with a couple of quotes, what we're going to get into today is realizing that in our day-to-day life, we perceive things differently than others, right? We've got to recognize that. And I'll start, as usual, from a personal experience, right? For most of my life, I assumed that people saw and perceived and understood things exactly as I did, to the point that I frequently, especially in my personal life and in my career life, did not think that I needed to explain things in great detail because obviously people understood it and perceived it exactly like I was perceiving it. Matter of fact, Doug and Derek, you probably saw me make this mistake even in our work experience, in our shared meetings. I'll edit that out, by the way. In our work career. So it took me a while to understand that people see things and perceive things differently, right? And that's the concept of separate realities, in the sense that how I'm perceiving things and how I'm reacting to events or interpreting events is different than maybe Derek is interpreting the same event or Doug is interpreting the same event. And I'll give some examples that as I was, kind of thinking about this topic and what we were going to discuss today, in several meetings this week, I tried to take the position of how are people in this meeting perceiving what's happening based upon, their life experience, based upon their conditioning, based upon their geographic space or whatever, or how their day is going, right? And not assuming that people are interpreting this in the same way that I am. And it was actually quite eye-opening as I've learned this over several years. Of course, I was putting it a lot into, some thought in it this week as I was prepping for this. But going back many years, learning that don't assume that everybody sees, understands things or perceives things exactly the way that you perceive them. You've got to ask questions. You've got to be curious, right? We've been using the Ted Lasso quote or Walt Whitman or whoever was the originator that be curious, not judgmental. And I think that really applies here in the sense that understanding somebody's perspective or why they, their background or whatever, asking questions is really, really beneficial. All right. I know that was a long-winded kickoff. Doug, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think like many things, this was something I really didn't have a good appreciation for or understanding of until later in life. And probably as I thought about mindfulness and learned how to observe myself, but also started to recognize, others out there maybe don't have they're not kind of recognizing that they're going through something different than I'm going through. And I guess the phrase that I typically think of is you never know what someone's going through, right? So as you're having an interaction with a stranger, as you're having an interaction with a work colleague, as you're trying to figure out, your children or your spouse or whatever, sometimes you have to step back and say, I don't know what they're going through. Like, you never know what someone's going through. So at work, there was times in my career where I really didn't enjoy a coworker or really one of my customers at work. And, I ended up, I guess it took my own personal recognition that, hey, I don't know what's going on in this person's personal life. They may have a terrible home life, and then they come into work and they take it out on everyone else or whatever. But it's just really recognizing that. And I'll give one other example. I'm a fairly impatient driver, and so as I'm out driving and somebody does something that I don't like, sometimes I have to remember and remind myself, hey, I don't know what's going on. They may have explosive diarrhea and they're trying to get home, just so that they can get to the toilet. You never know what someone else is going through. So be empathetic.
Derek, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that in line with what everybody else is saying, we all come from somewhere, and in that somewhere, we've went through a conditioning from an education. Maybe it's a religion, maybe it's a home life, the economics around that as well. And we all have different events and circumstances that happen in our life that gives us a perspective or insights, maybe even wisdom, whether that's good or bad. And I think that, this all comes back to the experience that you have, you know, from birth to where you are today, and everything that happens along the way brings you into a perspective of what you see as reality. I think, for me, some examples would be like, I grew up a country boy, so I grew up on a farm, and I milked cows, and I, cut tobacco, and I, cultivated tobacco and processed it. And, I would have friends that grew up in the city, and they would, you know, lay in their bed all day long, and they would watch videos and play, um, video games. And so for me, it's like I had a perspective of like, well, they're lazy, and I have a work ethic. I'm out here working every day. And so, it all comes around, what you're exposed to and your condition. I'm not saying that city kids are lazy, because they go work at retail stores, or they, have different chores around the house, and they have a different experience than I had. So, for the longest time, I would connect with that as somebody being lazy, but that's not their reality. It was my reality. So I think that we see it based on what experience we're living in the moment. It gives us how we see our reality, of what somebody else is or isn't, would be probably the best way I could lead in with this today.
Yeah, no, I think you both made really, really good points. So I'm going to double click on some of the points that you made. And kind of in my experience, right, again, is accepting or recognizing that folks are not processing information or not interpreting events or things the same way that you are, right? And understanding that when you're trying to interpret or understand why somebody or how somebody is coming to a conclusion or why they're interpreting in a certain way and maybe even driving their behavior, my confusion is often based upon a lack of information, right? A lack of information about that individual, right? And then once you ask questions, once you understand their programming, right, or their conditioning or their perspective, Doug, like you were saying, maybe something is going in, then things actually do make sense from their perspective, right? We're all doing the best we can with what we have and where we are. But understanding or taking the time and the commitment to help or to understand why people are doing that can be really, really beneficial. So one of the things that that I've been doing is at the office or whatever, inviting people for short walks, right? Just let's take a 5-minute walk around the block. And the perspective that I can get from where people are coming from. Hey, in that meeting you said that. What were you thinking? Can you help me to understand that? And usually they have
Mm.
quite a valid explanation, like, well, this is the way I think about it, or in my previous job we did it this way. Okay, I now understand your perspective. I may not agree with it, but I understand your perspective. And one of the things that has really helped me as well, it was quite a step for me several years ago when I started doing this, is don't assume I'm always correct, right? Assume maybe that the other people or what their interpretation makes sense, because from their perspective it absolutely does, right? And then uh, getting to the point of understanding the background and the history and that type of thing. If you assume that what they're doing is correct because it is from their perspective, really, really helps. And so taking that or making that commitment to help understand that really does a couple of things. It helps me to see from their perspective, from their background, especially when you're dealing with folks from other disciplines like designers, not like computer designers, but creative folks and others who have a completely different perspective than us in the computer space, right? Who tend to be relatively binary, no pun intended. But understanding their perspective has been really, really helpful. And I'll give you another example. And I think Derek, you'll really appreciate this, and Doug will as well. Is one of the things that I've had to do with my current company is implement enterprise safe agile, right, or pragmatic burnout. It's lean agile, or basic, right? But getting very creative folks who are not used to time boxing or not used to a sprint model and committing and being called out when sprint commitments aren't met, and not called out in a bad way, but recognizing that a failure to make a sprint commitment should be an exception, not the rule, was an interesting thing, because you've got to understand their perspective. They're used to just getting things perfect, right? Whereas perfect doesn't necessarily help the bottom line. 90% does, right? Getting an MVP out there, minimum viable product, can be really beneficial. But understanding both perspectives and coming to a common consensus or understanding has been super beneficial. Another example is, the three of us were together last Saturday, and again, we had already picked this topic, so it was in my head, and we were all having different perspectives on the social gathering, right? Different perspectives and interpret things differently. And I was watching my grandson, who is frequently in our house here, right? He stays here 2 days a week, and that type of thing. And he usually has a run of the house. He just goes anywhere, and he got his toy room and stuff like that. But there were 50 people here. So I noticed, we were all having the same, social interaction for the most part, but he was going from person to person, looking up, and then realizing he didn't know that person. So his interpretation of the events that were happening were radically different than us. And I thought that was a really good example. And he actually got, a little bit upset, because he would go to somebody, assume that, it was me or my wife or his parents or whatever, then look up, recognize, I don't know this person, and start getting a little bit anxious there. So anyway, that's a little bit of a strange example, but it does really hit home that although we're maybe receiving the same information from our senses, we're interpreting it based upon our own programming, our own filtering, our experiences, and our subconscious patterns. Thoughts on that?
Well, I think you know, it's about like to align with what you're saying. It's a curiosity, right? It's about, you know, leading yourself into a space of becoming interested and curious in how another sees something, or, you know, their perspective on something, and not making it wrong, but letting it be where it is and getting curious so you can gain further understanding. Like an example of that in my life was, a shift had to happen coming out of, a divorce. I had to make a shift to get curious of seeing things differently, to be able to move on to a new destiny, a new place in my life. And I had to dissolve a lot of judgments and assessments and conditioning from the past, even within my mindset, how you think you are, and having to undo that to be able to. And so it's like almost getting to make a shift within yourself, or to see something differently. You have to look inside yourself first, and get curious about why you are seeing it that way, and to be able to shift yourself to look at something differently, or to see something differently. And so, that's been a big transition I've made in my life the last 5 years, that I've had to do, that lines with this, to come into a new reality, space to move forward, which has paid significant dividends of growth, and just new perspective and new beginnings, and new experiences.
Yeah, I think we're all leaders in our roles and at work and other things like that, and so people do look to us to have opinions, to set directions, make choices, make decisions, and I think that's a place where sometimes I have to realize that, okay, I've formulated an opinion, and it's okay to live in my reality and have my context and my beliefs, and make my choices, but sometimes I do have to consciously recognize that, hey, I may need to seek out others' diverse opinions, or I may need to get like an opposing view and kind of see, how does that differ from mine, and process it, and those kind of things. And so I think one thing that has been hard for me is to realize, like, my view of the world isn't the only view of the world, and I need to put out the actual effort to go find out how I may be thinking about something wrongly. So, a little bit to your earlier point, Patrick, as far as like going to the people and saying, hey, help me understand your perspective. You also have to seek out other sources. And an interesting thing is, somewhere along the way in my career journey, like I was in an IT role, and I think someone hired like an artist or somebody like from a creative background to be part of the team. And I was like, what in the world? Like, why are you doing this? And, they kind of said like, hey, this person is smart and they have this skill set, and they're going to bring kind of a completely different viewpoint to our team. And I was like, okay. And they ended up coming in and really learning the IT part of it pretty well, but just bringing kind of their own creativeness to things was really helpful to the team. And I think we probably ended up producing better things than, if that person hadn't been there. So it's just a couple thoughts there.
Yeah, those are good. I'm gonna double click on something you said just a second ago, Doug, or a few minutes ago, and I'm gonna give you another quote from Wayne Dyer. Loving people live in a loving world. Hostile people live in a hostile world. Same world, right? And I think that you talked about mindfulness, and you do a great job of bringing mindfulness into these conversations, because we don't say it enough, or maybe we say it too much. I don't know, but mindfulness is foundational for a lot of the stuff that we talk about on this channel, and it is absolutely foundational for what we're talking about here. Because prior to my mindfulness, journey or whatever, I would not have had the intellectual capacity to slow down and try to appreciate somebody else's perspective. Well, that was a little bit hostile, but I wouldn't have. But true, right? The fact that I can observe my thoughts, right? I'm not reacting to thoughts is a completely different game changer. So the ability to understand, hey, something, I need to understand their perspective. So be present, be intentional about what you're doing, right? You don't have to be right. Seek the truth. Don't seek being right. And the only way that was foundational in my journey to get to that level of emotional maturity, emotional intelligence, whatever you want to call it, right, is the ability to observe my thoughts and not fuse with things that are happening. Because historically, if I perceived that folks were not interpreting the situation the way that I was almost offended by that. How could you not see it the way that I see it, right? Versus having this thought, I'm understanding it this way. Obviously, that person is not perceiving or interpreting the same way. I need to understand that a little bit better. And has really grounded me, made hopefully maybe a better human as well, but could not have gotten there without mindfulness and meditation and that type of thing. So again, just want to reinforce how important that component of it is. I'm going to give another quick example, and this was one that, again, it's coming from the work experience, but it was an individual that tends to come across as a grouch, like for a better term, a grouchy and kind of the right word, know-it-all, maybe, kind of. And so, in a desire to better understand how he was interpreting things or why he was coming from this position, again, took a walk, where my office is, and to get his perspective. And his perspective was, well, I'm the lead. That's the way I'm supposed to be. Okay. So his perspective was, this is what this is what he was charged with. You got to be know-it-all, because if you don't come across like that, then you're not doing your role. Now, we were able to course correct that. Like, no, dude, you've already earned people's respect. You don't have to be kind, right? You don't have to be a grouch. You don't have to be a know-it-all. If you don't know something, just say it. It doesn't mean you're less of a human being. It just means you are human, right? So that was helpful again as well. Understanding his perspective, coming together, and recognizing that, hey, we were on a different page. Same things are happening. We're interpreting them differently. And, we were able to overcome that. So good stuff
Yeah,
there.
I think one thing I'll say, you brought up Wayne Dyer's quote, "Loving world, hostile world." One of the things in my journey that really resonated me, that Wayne Dyer's a quote from him says, "Be open to everything and attached to nothing."
Yeah.
And I think that's very powerful in this conversation of you know, different experiences and, whether it's personal or professional from different individuals, human beings, they bring their own way of operating, their own energy. They bring their own, baggage at times, or, negatively, but also they bring a positive energy. They're inspiring, they're engaging, they're bubbly, they're, energetic, and bring that energy. And I think that we as human beings, as leaders of ourselves, have to be able to bring ourselves in that space of being with whoever shows up and whatever shows up in any moment, being okay with it and being able to, as you were sharing, Patrick, go on a walk and get into their world for a moment and see what's going on. And I think that serves us as very valuable, and it definitely feeds another energy out into the world that's not judgmental. It's not assessment. It doesn't lead people to feeling like they're being judged and assessed, and it creates an opening for maybe a potential new way forward in the relationship or in the operations of what they need to do or fulfill. I think that's a very important thing in understanding everybody's realities and the differences of those realities.
Yep. Doug, thoughts?
Yeah, I can't remember exactly when when I learned about it, but I think it's been very important in my growth to being more of an empathetic person. I mean, again, I said it earlier and I'll say it again. You never know what someone else is going through. And I think as a person just going through daily life and interacting with strangers and interacting with coworkers or whatever, sometimes I just try to remind myself, like, hey, something could be going on with this person. So, be more understanding and those kind of things. But I guess also an opposing part to that is recognize, like having the mindfulness to kind of step back and recognize that in a lot of interactions, the default behavior for me is confirmation bias. So, as I'm talking to them, I'm saying, hey, okay, they get it. They're on the same page with me. Move on. Like, or, again, you've all had a leader who you can tell is just seeking out the people's opinions that are on the same page as them.
Yeah.
And they don't take the time to go kind of seek out like how they could be wrong or those kinds of things. So anyways, just my quote for this episode is, you never know what someone else is going through.
That's very true. Very, very true. All right, it looks like we are coming close to time here. So just some parting thoughts. I've got a couple of other quotes, but this one is very powerful, and it kind of hits a nail on the head. We don't see things as they are. We see them as we are, right? And again, that ties into what you were saying, Doug. We don't know what is going on in each other's lives, but we got to recognize that what is happening biases or filters or somehow impacts the way that they're interpreting events. Things that may seem innocent and whatever could be interpreted as a trigger or whatever the case may be. So, all right, any parting thoughts, Derek?
Yeah, I would just encourage our listeners to, as we all are guilty of this, of being judgmental and assessing things first, I would challenge all of us to operate by curiosity and seeking to gain understanding first. And I think that will create an opening for you in your life and for others that you interact with on a personal or professional level and make a difference.
Doug?
Yeah, I think really aligned to this topic is kind to yourself and be kind to others. So like have this topic is about having compassion and recognizing that like we're living in our own reality and we don't fully understand everyone else's reality. So, be kind to yourself and be kind to others.
Yep, absolutely. And keep in mind that positive change is possible. As Epictetus said, It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. And remember, be curious, not judgmental. Have a great week. Thank you all.
Bye, everyone.